No, it was, well, yes, on purpose, by me. Jim will talk about the one thing that there's no overlap. You're gonna need to. In the hallway, it's all done. That's right, the whole text campaign that I on the last. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I had been waiting, I wasn't gonna wait, but I'm in discussion. But after Monday, I did what else did, so I didn't.
Did you get mine now?
Yeah,
so I think
I'm posting them right now.
Okay, thank you.
You disappear, right?
Beginning of September.
Oh, okay. Hard.
Hard.
Yes, we want to be done in like doing the last fall.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me to write this out, it's kind of number one is to get cozy, revisions up there.
Right.
And that should be done by the time we go there.
No, actually, right now,
All right, great, then we'll get that done and get people. Awesome. Okay, is it a must?
Yeah, before, I mean, if that's what you want, you'll have that.
And then, yes, we'll get there to push it on the other way and I'll press off.
Done.
Thank you.
If you really want, we'll tell you what we decided.
Okay, by my watch, it's time to begin. So this is LAMPS. It's the first meeting of the group. I just got the last presentation, and what I was doing here was posting it. That has happened. So all of the slides have been posted. And so we're ready to go with that. The first thing, as always, is to go through the note well.
The first thing is always to make
So we got volunteers on the list for JabberScribe and for minute taking. So thank you to those volunteers. The other administrative piece is the blue sheets. They have started around. Please make sure you sign them. Here's the note well. You probably have seen it by now a lot this week. Please review it, and if there's and the RFCs that it points to. Here's our agenda. So we're going to talk about the enhancements to SMIME to support authenticated encryption, email addresses that use or internationalized email addresses in certificates, and then one of the kernel action items deals with the new curves and how to carry them in certificates. Since the people who understand certificates are in here, we're going to talk about the which object identifiers will be used to name the algorithms in that situation. That's the three things. And then at the end, we'll do some calls, some hums for whether some documents should get adopted by the working group. Any agenda bashes? Okay, Jim, you're up.
Step one. Yes, this is live. For anyone who doesn't recognize me, my name is Jim Shad. I run a winery, so that's my logo. Next. So there's currently a private draft up there for the messages. It has the updates to say, this is how you put in authenticated enveloped data here, you wrap it up here. It talks about how you use SMIME capabilities to say, I implement this algorithm, probably at this point AES GCM, and if a sending client sees that you have AES GCM in your SMIME capabilities as a list of algorithms you support, then it knows that it should use the authenticated enveloped data structure rather than the enveloped data structure to set up the CMS object for the message this encrypts with. I've added AES GCM as a must algorithm so that we actually have at least one algorithm in here to support. I've pulled in all but one of the errata updates, so those are all cleaned in. And if what we want to say is all we're going to do is say this is how we do authenticated encryption, which is what the charter says, we can declare victory, go home, and be happy at this point in time. Next slide. Okay, I didn't quite get that right. I lied on 2 issues. Issue number 1, what version of SMIME is this? Right now the document says 3.5 because that's what Sean Turner wants. I don't care. There's an open errata from Peter Gutman which says, oh, look, there's these things that are called examples in this document, and guess what? They actually aren't examples. They aren't formed right. They actually don't do what they're supposed to do. So the question is, do we modify the titles on these to say they aren't examples, or do we actually really make them examples? Either way works, and I don't think it matters. Then there's a set of other issues which we can talk about in terms of since we have the document open, do we want to fix them? Basically, after discussion earlier this week with Russ, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fly through these issues. I'm going to give an opinion. And then what we're going to basically do is I'm going to start feeding these onto the mailing list at a rate which seems to correspond with discussions, and we'll try to resolve them on the list rather than trying to work them out here. So things like, do we change from 88 syntax?
Wait a minute, Jim. Point of clarification. Please don't leave the room without understanding what the issue is. I just don't want to pick among the alternatives today because we only have 60 minutes.
Okay. Issue number 1, do we change from 88 syntax of ASN1 to modern day syntax? At this point in time, I would say we leave things alone. Since we're not actually changing the ASN1 module itself, there's no particular reason to update the module and do something new. There may be some additional security considerations people want to bring up. I have got a couple that I probably need to write relative to authenticated encryption. But other than that, I'm not too sure that we need anything special.
Okay, Yovnir, what does it mean that the examples are not real examples?
If you try to ASN1 decode the bytes, they don't. They are illustrative examples of what the MIME should look like, not what SMIME looks like.
Please fix them.
+1.
No, I'm thinking of the poor guys who will be taking that 2 years from now and try to implement and verify their code against the examples, and it doesn't work and things like that. It's a mess. Yeah, so no, please fix them.
Yeah, I mean, in point of fact, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, where we really say today with all our examples, if you want examples, go to RSC 4134.
Right.
Because that's where real examples are.
So on the ASN1 version, Sean Leonard says, we're updating the table constraints and information object classes. Therefore, the new ASN1 module 2002 plus should be updated at some point. However, I think it's okay for this document to list 88 syntax normatively.
Okay. Next slide. Most of the people are going to want to say, since we got the document open, we want to adjust algorithms. We want to adjust key sizes. And there's a whole slew of questions. Do we deprecate? How hard do we deprecate some? Do we want to add things other than the minimums that I currently have in there? And I think that's probably a discussion that just works better if we take them on one each at a time on the list. Next slide. Since we're adding this, we may want to change some of the text in section 2.7 in terms of we give recommendations on what you should do if you come up in a situation where I want to send an encrypted message to somebody and I don't know what they do. So right now it tends to be, if you want to go all the way down to triple des, because that's what was supported in some ancient version of SMIME, that's fine. It may not be the best choice, but it's an acceptable choice. I think we may want to definitely eliminate triple des. We may want to think about whether we want to make language a little bit more. You probably don't want to think about using AES-CBC, but here's where you want to say you do. So that's it's guidance. It's not 2111 language or 2119 language. That's very hard. It's all shoulds. Next. We talked earlier about header protection with a small group of people this week. Right now, the default position on this is we're not doing anything in this document. If we do something, we'll do something later after a recharter. So, because this is a hard issue, we don't really want to touch it right now. Next.
Actually, I think this one is discouraged by the current charter language. So we'd have to work with our AD if we want to tackle this one, I think.
We're updating email addresses and certificates to use the international email addresses. Interesting question. Do we need to update the SMIME certificate document to talk about international email addresses as well? Right now, it's not clear whether the charter says do that or not to do that.
I think the charter says do that. That's my reading.
If we open up that document, then we'll also have the same algorithms and key sizes arguments for that draft that we do for the message draft.
Well, actually, that's a very good reason to do it. It would be silly for those two documents not to have agreement.
Right. I mean, my default position is we should do it. It's just, it wasn't immediately clear. Next. Okay. Are there any other issues that people know of that need to be discussed, or are any of these issues that I've covered unclear?
Stephen Farrell. So, and a clarity kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of changes that we could suggest to make to the documents, which would be kind of good improvements to the documents. I just want to check that we're all on the same page, that we accept that there's only a point in doing those if implementations are liable to follow them. So even though there's probably a bunch of things we'd all like the documents to say, but that we won't have a chance this time because people actually probably won't make such changes.
Yeah, I've got some nice big changes I'd love to do, which I look at them and say they're not realistic.
Yeah, so I think there's maybe a lot of that, unfortunately, but that's reality.
Yep.
Hi, from Sean Leonard. I think we should update SMIME to discuss EAI. EAI, yeah. Also update SMIME to talk about how the inner SMIME content, which is binary clean, has or ought to have UTF-8 headers consistent with EAI. And should there be SMIME compatibility OID for EAI? Just topic to think about.
Alexi, do you have any advice on that last one? Well, you weren't paying attention. Could you
Sure.
updating the
Yeah,
headers to
should there
deal with
be-
UTF-8?
Yeah, two questions. One, should we update the headers for the inner MIME content? And should there be an SMIME capability OID for EAI?
So the only place I can think of, no, I guess sub 822 headers. So for inside of a message / RFC 822 is the only place I can think of immediately where you would have UTF-8 headers.
Yes, but you can have arbitrary nesting, so I suppose you
Talk
can
to the
have it at any
microphone,
level.
please.
John Levine was saying that it will be message global, not message RFC 822, but you can have nesting it, you can still construct and have it at lower level of nesting anyway, so.
So what you're saying is by changing the reference from message RFC 822 to message global, we would get that for free.
I think the answer is probably yes, but I think we need to think about all the modifications and are there any restrictions about.
Let's check that out.
Yeah,
Because
okay.
if it's that easy, we should do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? So
Who's taking minutes? Make sure you grab that one for me, please. Thank you.
all right. Thank you, Jim. Wei, you get your slides up here.
Hello. All right. My name is Wei Chuan. I'm doing this work with Alexei Melnikov. So this is about internationalized email addresses and X509 certificates. Next slide. So what's being done in this draft is changing or creating a new name type for email addresses that would represent the email address as UTF-8, as opposed to the current RFC 822 name, which is in ASCII. And so this allows for the local part in particular to be UTF-8. This draft also specifies that the domain should be ulabel or ASCII, but excludes intentionally A labels. And I can get into that later. This also says that this will be encoded as part of other names, as opposed to being a part of general names, and I'll get into that in a moment. Next slide. So let me just get into some of the interesting sort of choice points. These could be potential also open issues, but I'll try to describe some of the reasoning behind this. And first, with regards to other name versus say adding to general names. So let me first get into the downside. So other names means that there's going to be potential overhead. There's going to be a new object identifier added, and this will slightly increase the size of the certificate. The reason for going for other names is that this is the extension point in these name types, and there's a lot of assumption that implementation seems to have made about this. So the types in general names seem to be hard-coded, at least in the places I've looked. Like I've looked in OpenSSL, and a comparison of general names is basically just a switch statement with all the currently enumerated names. And there isn't a default that says, okay, here's what you do if you find something new. that particular place I looked at, it doesn't seem like it would break, but I can imagine in the many other places this has been implemented that there could be some amount of breakage. So it seems like it's probably a good idea to take this overhead hit and just go for compatibility. Then the other design choice point is basically name constraints. So SMTP UTF-8 name, this draft says that name constraints on it with regards to other name types, such as distinguished names or RFC 822 names, that it does not specify a restriction on the other name constraints. I'm sorry, name constraints of SMTP UTF-8 name does not constrain the other distinguished name or RFC 822 names. And that was an intentional decision so that the having these dependencies could cause confusion and in the implementations. And this draft tries to avoid that. However, this will mean that then if you want to have a name constraint potentially for international email addresses or just pure ASCII local part addresses, you'll have to then have a name constraint with both RFC 822 name as well as SMTP UTF-8 name, which could potentially increase the size of usually these are done, in a CA certificate. It would cause some expansion there potentially. Next slide. Okay, just talking about the version history and the closed issues. So in draft 01, basically this was about getting feedback that we ought to just have, we should try to minimize the choices for the domain encodings. And the worry was that implementations may get additional choices wrong. And then also a request to minimize the conversions between the different types when doing the canonicalization, say for comparison. And also to provide language in the draft for specifying name constraints and comparisons. For version 02 and 03, there's a significant amount of language and specification cleanup, particularly for Unicode, changing the terminology from ACE, ASCII compatible encoding to A labels, cleanup of some of the type specification, and also cleanup of the references for the various internationalization RFCs. There's also a request to restrict SMTP UTF-8 names to non-ASCII local parts, and then essentially reserve RFC 822 name for ASCII local parts. So you can see then this would then have cause this name constraint issue to be slightly more important. There's also a request for additional comparison language cleanup. Next slide. And then in version 04, there's language cleanup and a diagram added to help illustrate the name constraint and its interactions with, between SMTP UTF-8 name and RFC 822 name. So for the deployment situation, basically, I've contacted the OpenSSL folks. They say that it should be very doable to get something added for this. It would take them about a year because that's their normal release cycle for doing updates. We have not talked to the CAs about this, but then this has not been published. We do have, or I have contacts in the Chrome security teams who have contacts with the CA industry that could help get this deployed. And that concludes this presentation. Are there questions?
Tarek from Inside Secure. One question about what happens if you have both RFC 822 and this especially in the security, because security consideration section doesn't say anything about this having, both of these. Which in some cases, for example, IPsec, we are matching, identities, and if some applications take, RFC 822 part of that, and some applications take, the UTF 8 version of it. It might cause security issues.
So I'd like to answer that one because I think the answer is in 5280. Yeah, basically it says all of the name forms that appear are bound to the public key.
Yeah, but okay. So I mean, yes, but I was meaning that if you have an email, if I have I basically configuration having an email address.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say it's going to be in RFC 822 part of that. It doesn't say it's in the UTF-8 part. It just says an email address. So I'm supposed to match it probably after this. I'm supposed to match it in both fields.
Right.
And now if the CA allows.
Wait a minute. That part goes into the document, the certs document that Jim said we now need to update.
All right.
That's where it is.
Jim Schutt. There's one other deployment consideration you haven't listed here, which is in some respects harder than the CAs, in some respects is easier than the CAs, and that is you need to talk to the people who are actually creating certificate requests.
Okay, I'll take that feedback.
Good point.
Sean Leonard, an observation. It is strange that X509 provides 2 extension points for extending general names. Other name with an open type table is the older one, more likely to be widely deployed. Other name is also more compatible with ASN 188 syntax compared to the ellipsis construct.
Okay. I'll take that feedback.
So he's agreeing with you, I think. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Wei. Jim?
We now have a slight digression into the Curdle meeting. Okay, next slide. Right. I have to remember what the slides are again. So basically we start with just some preliminary things about if we're looking at EDDSA and ED Diffie-Hellman, there are some simple things that we need to keep in mind when we're making decisions. Private keys are always octet strings. In this case, they aren't integers. A public key is also an octet string. However, the format of what's in that octet string is different if you're doing EDDSA versus if you're doing ECDH. That means that one of the things we have to make sure we do is we identify which sides we're dealing with a private key, whether it's for Diffie-Hellman or whether it's for signatures. And there's also a question of whether there's other potential Diffie-Hellman key agreement algorithms that may show up again in the future. The original EDDH document did talk about MQV. It's just not clear how much MQV is actually used in anything in the real world. Next. So trying to go through Simon's document. This is basically the table of what I came up with, where things go, and what OIs would be put into different places. It's something that I don't think actually works with what we currently have. I did call out each of the curves separately because one of the things that has been made clear by the people who have wrote the EDDSA document is that we have to make sure we keep the prehash and the non-prehash keys separate, because otherwise you can there are attacks between them if you use them on both of them. So
Jim, what I think you just said was if you use the same private key with both prehash and not prehash, there's some attacks.
Correct.
Okay. It was a little convoluted, so I wanted to make sure.
the document originally used an enumeration in terms of looking at the signature algorithms. It was suggested that basically we should probably go to an OID to make things life simpler. But we kind of basically have looked at this and said it's kind of fun. Okay, next slide. So if we do this based upon what we actually currently have and do all the logical extensions, obviously we have to kill the ID EC public key portion out of all of the signature algorithms. But it's a little bit clearer moving things straight across so that the same OIDs are showing up straight across in a little bit better fashion than what they are otherwise. I exchanged some mail with Kenny, and he basically says we really ought to be removing the IDEC public key from the first two lines as well. There aren't any known attacks that we actually currently have, but historic evidence suggests that we don't know that attacks may not come in the future. The tighter you bind the key to an algorithm, the better off you are. And so this is actually a slightly cleaner one than the one in the current draft. However, if we go to the next slide, we come up with one that's actually, in some respects, even cleaner, because it doesn't have any of the, we're reducing everything down to a single OID. So it makes things really clear. It's the exact same value in all three columns. You only ever have to deal with one thing. You are guaranteed that you'll never have any confusion about what you're doing. Next slide. So real fast review of the benefits between the last two proposals up there. The AS encoding is more or less 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. They're both easy to do. They're both reasonably well understood. There are some potential issues in terms of publishing and negotiation of algorithms. I can't come up with anything specific, but that was my one worry about it, in that it may be easier to say, I mean, currently what you say is I'm going to negotiate an ECDSA algorithm. I'm not specifying that I'm negotiating ECDSA for a specific key. With the Benjamin proposal, basically, when you do that negotiation, you're negotiating the algorithm and the key at the same time. There was actually somebody on the list, I cannot remember who it was, who basically says the fact that you can't negotiate them separately is really good, because when he goes off and looks at the certificate transparency stuff, he can't figure out whether or not he's going to support that algorithm until he's actually grabbed the certificate and done all of that work. Because he doesn't know what the actual curve is he's playing with. He just knows that it's ECDSA. There is a possibility as future algorithms come along, if you've used the middle proposal, you just define the curvoid, you're done. We use the Benjamin proposal, you have to define all four of those, or I guess all three new OIDs. So you have to have one for ECDH, you have to have one for EDDSA, you have to have one for EDDSA prehash. It's not that hard to get OIDs. It's just potentially a little bit more work to get them through all of the CAs than it is otherwise. Misuse of curves, we always look at that and say, it's probably, I don't know that either one of them gives us a better answer than the other one. But in terms of the group of us that met at the beginning of the week, we all basically boiled down to, let's just use the Benjamin proposal. It's simple, it's well understood, and I don't think there's there's no problems that we know of that would arise from having it.
Sean Turner, as an author of 5480, I'm A-OK with David Ben's proposal. I really, I really never liked the SecG stuff that got adopted.
Next slide. And here's part of the SecG stuff that got adopted that we really want to shoot. One symmetric key is actually essentially what you get out of PKCS 8. It's been updated so that the public key field is down there in the bottom. Other than that, it's essentially the same thing as the PKCS 8. So if you do Diffie-Hellman or DSA or RSA, it's very simple. You do what's on the left hand. You do the one symmetric key. You put that integer or that private key structure into the octet string. You're done. If you do ECDSA or ECDH today, what you do is you put the EC private key in that field, and look at all the nice duplications you have there. So basically, what we want to do is for the Montgomery curve, for all these new curves, we want to say that the private key is going to be an octet string. And you put the octet string into that private key field in the PKS8 blob, and you're done. You know, you don't have any worry about whether this matches that and so forth as you go along. Next. Do people want to kibitz?
So there's at least one Curdle working group chair in here.
Well,
So
that's what the next step.
well, I think some words about whatever we say here, how does that feedback work to the document authors?
We'll direct them to take it as gospel.
Okay. Has Simon agreed to update the document based on what we said is really what I meant to say.
That's a different question.
Yes.
I have a question. So if we have a single OID for EDDSA in a signature blob, so how do we distinguish between 25519 and 448?
They each get a different OID.
Oh, so the different OIDs.
Okay. I mean, if you look, the operation is basically, this is what goes in the signature field.
Okay, so there's 3 OIDs for each curve, not for each algorithm. There.
There's 1 OID for each curve algorithm pairing.
From Sean Leonard, so you're saying the one asymmetric private key, the octet string contains EC private key, is that right?
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's what happens with today. With this, we are going to just hold an octet string.
I might be back.
So you have MQV stuff on here. We're not proposing to allocate OIDs for that, or
I'm not proposing to allocate OIDs for MQV. It's a thought experiment as things go along.
okay,
One of the questions was, if we did it, what happens?
sure. But good that we're not proposing to do stuff for undefined stuff.
Sean Turner says it came from OpenSSL. He was just reflecting what appeared to be reality, but I'm okay with swapping it to be simpler.
Right. Okay. I want to be clear. We are not changing any of the NIST curve private key structures. We're only doing this for the new CFRG curves.
Questions? Okay, I want to take a quick hum at this point. Does this group want to recommend to Curdle that the David Benjamin proposal be adopted? Hum yes, hum no. Hum now if you think this group should recommend the David Benjamin proposal to the Curdle group. Hum now if you think this group should not make that recommendation. Thank you. Okay, so those were the presentations we had planned for the meeting. Now come the hums that are about document adoption. So we have 2 drafts before us. The first one, the Jim, I'm sorry? Yes, I know. I have no slides. We have two that we're looking at adopting as working group at this point. Jim's wants to correct me. Which one? We don't have a copy yet of the updated certs, right?
I haven't published it. It exists.
Can't adopt something we haven't had an opportunity to read yet. So one's coming, two we have in hand. The two we have in hand are the ones I want to talk about. So the first one is the one that Jim presented about message, which is basically the update of what the SMIME working group had called the message spec. And it is to incorporate what is needed to do authenticated encryption in SMIME. The hum will be to adopt this within this working group or not yet. Okay, so those interested in adopting this document now, hum yes, now. Those who think the document's not ready for working group adoption. Okay. Thank you.
Jabber is unanimous too.
Thank you. And the second hum has to do with, are we ready to adopt the document that Wei walked us through, which is for the EAI internationalized email addresses, how to carry them in certificates. So it'll be hum now for adoption or not ready. So if you think it's ready for this working group to adopt, hum now. If you think it's not ready, hum now. Very straightforward. All right. So we've agreed to send the recommendation to the Kernel working group. We've adopted the two documents, and that's all the business we had for today, unless someone wants to raise something very quickly. Thank you very much. Have a very safe trip home.
No, I just have to, I just have to. Yeah, we'll get the documentation updated. No, thank you. Yeah, you too. All right. Again, yes. I know. Good to see you.
That's why I'm saying it should be. Pointing that out.
If you didn't sign the blue sheet, please do so now.
Throwing out small things. Yeah,